Okay, so Jordan, Matthew, and I decided to do our presentation on DNA and the job that revolves around it.
First, we're going to start off with what the field entails, and professionals in this industry are called DNA analysts, and they primarily work in laboratory settings, and they are examining evidence gathered by police officers, crime scenes, and investigators. They focus on identifying samples of DNA, such as blood, hair follicles, and other bodily fluids. Most analysts work in a laboratory preparing and testing samples.
In this slide, we're going to talk about the techniques used in this field. The first one is extraction. And extraction is the process of releasing the DNA from the cell. The second one is quantitation. And quantitation is the process of determining how much DNA you have. The third one is amplification. And amplification is the process of producing multiple copies of the DNA in order to characterize it. And we have separation. Separation is the process of separating the amplified DNA products to permit subsequent identification. Then we have analysis and interpretation, and that is the process of quantitatively and qualitatively comparing DNA evidence samples to no DNA profiles. Finally, we have quality assurance, and that is the process of reviewing analyst reports for technical accuracy.
This is DNA extraction, and this is a picture of the process of a DNA extraction with a swab. And this process allows the DNA to be separated from the swab into a form that can be examined.
This is a detailed step-by-step process of a extraction. First, they're going to take a trace sampling, and I'm going to talk about the conventional technique, which is what we would use because it's in a forensic science lab. And you can either take a DNA sample with a cotton swab or a nylon floss swab. Next, you're going to work up the sample, and that's either thermal or chemical. And then it can be purification of organic, and it can also be put in spin columns. And then amplification reactions is the isothermal amplifications, and it can be either MDA, which is multiple displaced amplification, or the LAMP, and we also have a video about that for after this. And then there's detection, which is just the analysis part of it.
These are the different types of cells in the body where DNA can be found. The most common are sweat, saliva, blood cells, urine, and sex cells like semen.
I have case 1, and in this case, this guy right here, Philip Cross, raped, strangled, and bludgeoned Tracy Hammerberg right here, who was an 18-year-old girl at the time. And on December of 1984, Hammerberg left to go to a party but never returned home. She was found half naked from the waist down in a driveway as shown in the picture right here on the slide. And after the case was cold, 35 years later, forensic scientists used DNA evidence from Hammerberg's body and compared it to public genealogy databases that thousands of people use to learn about their family history. And the sheriff on the case, Sheriff James Johnson, said that investigators spent months creating a family tree, going back several generations to eventually match DNA to Philip Cross, who's actually her second cousin and who was 21 years old at the time of the murder. And the sheriff also said that Cross's job put him in the area where Hammerberg was that night, but Philip Cross never faced any punishment because he died in 2012 from a drug overdose. But he did have a lengthy criminal history that included a lot of domestic violence.
Okay, for our next case, we're going to talk about Colin Pitchfork, and he raped and murdered two 15-year-old girls, and he was the first to be convicted by using DNA. So the first girl, named Linda, who was 15, in 1983, she was going to visit a friend, and she never showed up, and then a week later her body was found, and it turned out that she was raped. At the crime scene, investigators took samples of semen and DNA, but there was no leads on the case, so the case was cold. And then a few years later, in 1986, a girl named Dawn, her body was found dead, and it turned out that she was raped and beaten the same way that Linda was. And investigators took DNA samples, and nothing showed up until a guy named Alec Jeffrey designed a new technique of connecting DNA fingerprints and semen, and he took samples from all the local men, and then nothing still matched to the case. But a guy named Ian Kelly in a bar was bragging about how his friend was paid $200 to give his DNA sample to a guy named Colin Pitchfork. And at the time, Colin was 17 when he raped the first girl, and he was later arrested, and his DNA matched both of the cases.
In this slide, we're going to talk about case number 3, which is the case of Craig Cooley. And in this case, Craig Cooley was convicted of murder and life in prison in 1978 for murdering his girlfriend. But at the time, some of the DNA samples from the crime scene seemed to be lost or destroyed. And so with the evidence they had, they convicted Craig Cooley of murder and life in prison. However, 39 years later, they found some of the DNA samples, and at that time they had new technology which allowed them to test the samples, and they found out that the DNA did not come back to Craig Cooley, but instead someone else. And so then Cooley was released after 39 years in prison, which just goes to show how important the advancements in DNA technologies are, because he could have spent life in jail if it weren't for them.
A DNA specialist usually makes around $66,000 yearly, and this video down below goes more into detail about the profession.
Our pop culture references are Spider-Man and Awakenings. And for Spider-Man, it's about the manipulation of DNA, because at 15 years old, Peter Parker was bitten by a spider on his hand, and that's what gives him his powers, because it manipulates his DNA. And then Awakenings is about a group of teenagers that were born in the 1920s, and they were suddenly stricken with the sleep sickness pandemic, and they were all put to sleep and they couldn't do anything until Dr. Sawyer. He took the courtesy of finding a drug called L-Dopa that would manipulate their DNA to waken them up again. But sadly, the patients grew a tolerance for the drug, and they were put back to sleep by the end of the movie.